If you take anything away from this, please take this away. When you're spinning yarn, you need to be nice to yourself. Welcome back, fiber friends and fellow fiber chaos goblins. My name is Brian. This is the Wool to Gold podcast, and we talk about all things yarn related. Spinning yarn, what we do with our hand spun yarns, I don't know, hand dyeing yarn sometimes. I'm not really a dyer. I mostly spin the yarn. We mostly talk about that here. This week, we're going to be talking about my top tips for hand spinning. So I don't know exactly how many tips I'm going to have yet, so we'll find out at the end of this video. I'm just going to share some of my, I think, biggest tips that I have when it comes to spinning yarn and sort of getting into the rhythm and trying to figure out your default yarn. I'm holding this skein because this is a skein of my default yarn. As you can see, it has a bit of a green cast to it, but we're gonna talk about that later. We are going to be giving my tips and tricks for hand spinning and some of the really common barriers and trouble points that people run into when they start spinning. All of these tips are going to be things that I was told from other hand spinners, whether that be online or in person. So I don't take credit for like inventing any of this information. I just want to pass on, all the tips that I've collected over my year of spinning to pass on to those of you who maybe just started. Because there are a surprising number of things that we all run into when we start spinning. And if you aren't really a part of the spinning community yet, you might feel really alone in some of the struggles that you're running into, because maybe your yarn just doesn't look like the hand spun yarn that you see on Instagram and things like that. I am going to be busting out some of my very first hand spun yarn as well to talk about, because it kind of carries along with some of the tips that I have. But before we get to that, we do have to do our whip check. I don't have a ton of progress on my whips. If you were here last week, you know I like to be transparent about the real-time making. You know, I am not doing anything all that fast. I do this part-time, but I do like to share my little progress points with you. So first things first, we are going to share the crochet whip that I'm working on. If you want to know about the actual details on the yarn, go to episode 5 of the Wool to Gold podcast, where I talk about this yarn. However, this is how far we've got. We've got 2 burgundy blocks, and we're working on the next turquoise one. It's looking pretty good. I'm loving it so far. I think I'm going to have exactly the right amount of yarn. Next up, I do want to talk about my drop spindle because it is getting really full, guys. I'm not really sure how to know when your drop spindle is full. I'm kind of hoping that it's going to be like a spinning wheel where it tells you, like, there just comes a point where you cannot put any more yarn onto something, and you'll know it when you hit it, trust me. I know it when I hit it on a spinning wheel, but I'm just spinning up this same colorway. It's called Ocean. I'm not going to give you the dyer's info because they don't dye anymore, and they haven't since like 2008, so I'll insert a video of my spinning project that's on the Shacked Matchless right now. I am still spinning up that same colorway from last week, A Day in the Orchard by the Skirted Fleece Mill in Pennsylvania. It's a yak fine wool silk blend. It's absolutely stunning. Super beautiful spin, but it is taking me a while. It's a lot of fiber. And the only new thing that I've put on a spinning wheel, I put on my Lendrum this week, finally put something new on my Lendrum. It's a great wheel, or for me, I use it for a lot of my smaller spins, and then I use my Shacked for a lot of my larger spins. Anyway, this is what I'm spinning on my Lendrum. It is a fine wool alpaca and silk blend from Hidden Pastures, and I just love this color. I think it looks really nice with a lot of the blues that I tend to wear, because I wear a lot of blue. I think it's really pretty. It's spinning up to be, I think, fingering weight. It might be a little bit lighter than fingering weight. I'm spinning it the grist that it wants to be spun, which frankly is super duper light. And I'm really fine with that because I think it's going to have a nice amount of drape to it based on the ingredients that are in this roving. I think I'll end up using it for kind of a lacy project. So that's how that's working up. I do have the rest of my finished object spins from last week finally twisted up in hanks and labeled, as you can see. So you can tell these two soaked together. I don't want it to be blown out, and I want you guys to be able to tell that this one, so this is the truest white sample I have in my collection. It's a bleached white Polworth silk spin. It's just a little sample spin, but you can tell that this is a little bit warmer than this, and that's because it sat in the same water as this spin. This is the finished chain plied first third, I guess, spin of that really nice blend that I was talking about that I'm spinning now. Just fantastic. I would definitely buy from this dyer again. In the entire braid, with all of these super intense colors, there was one felted spot that needed removal, and it was like this big. It was such a small piece. I'm gonna go get it. I'm gonna go get it to show what a small piece it was. Because I understand how difficult it is to dye. That's the reason that I don't dye fiber, because I think it's really, really difficult. And this is really the only piece I had to remove because of felting. And you can see, if I had just like kind of worked with it, I probably could have gotten a little bit of yarn out of this, but it just, the rest of it was such a pleasurable spin. I'm gonna end up buying so much more really intensely dyed fiber from that dyer, because this braid was just so well taken care of. I'm very impressed. And then moving on, this is the finished spin of that Tunis. I chain plied it. I'm calling it Cowboys. What am I calling it? Even cowboys get the blues. Tom Robbins reference. I like some of Tom Robbins' books. I think Jitterbug Perfume was top notch. But I soaked this skein with it, and as you can see, it has a bit of a green cast to it. As a result, I really think that in both of these cases, it's going to rinse out, but it does irritate me. I know it shouldn't, but I'm going to take a big photo of all of my white spins next to each other at some point, and these probably won't be able to be included because they don't look white. They look whiter in person too, but the way they look on camera, you can really see that they like soaked with another yarn. And yeah, that's all the whips. Have no finished objects this week unless you count the very surprisingly controversial move that I made this week, which was to put the ratio numbers on my whirls for my shacked. I'm not worried about the resale value of these parts. I feel like I've talked about this a little bit on my TikTok. I hope I'm gonna get buried with one of these fast whirls, I swear. I feel like people had big feelings about it because if you know shacked and you know the whirls, if I put these on a ladybug or a sidekick or a flat iron, other shacked wheels, essentially, the ratio will change, like it won't be the same, and I am just going to write the ratio for that wheel somewhere else on the whirl in a different color. That is what I plan on doing for all of these whirls as I collect a bunch of shacked wheels. I don't know. I have a feeling that, again, I'm not going to want to resell these, that I'm going to want to hold on to them. I don't see a time in the next 5 years that I'm going to be getting rid of these, so I'm going to treat them like they're mine. I'm going to write the ratios on them. I want to be a better yarn spinner. I want to know my ratios and write them down when I spin yarn. So we finally finished doing that. I think this is going to be a good move for me. And then the only project that I am planning on maybe starting this week, if I have the time, is finally taking apart this sweater and upcycling the yarn from it. It's actually not a sweater. It's like a big, I don't know what you call this, poncho, I guess, with a nice big neck on it. It's gonna be a ton of yarn. I mean, look at all that cableage. So I'm gonna use some of this and probably turn it into some other type of garment. But then with the leftover yarn, what I wanted to do, or what I think I'm gonna do first, honestly, is ply some of this to a recycled ply that I spin out of all of these scraps that I have. My scrap bag is just getting a little full for my taste, and I think it's time that I make another upcycled yarn. They always look really cool. I'm always pleased with the way they come out. However, I think I would be more pleased if it was plied with this like upcycled cream. I don't know why. I think it's gonna look very cool. I just do. I have a gut feeling. I think these are born to be together. And I like the idea of making a yarn where both the elements are recycled or upcycled, but in different ways. All right, so I have no acquisitions this week, no mail this week. So we're gonna just look over some of my very first yarns that I ever spun that I keep in this super cute bag that I got from Fiberspace down in Alexandria, Virginia. Super, super cute, like spinning and local yarn shop. We're gonna look over some of these very first spins and we're gonna talk about them, and I'm gonna give you some top tips for starting to spin yarn. Okay, so the first of the yarns that I wanted to start with is my very, very, very first yarn. So let me find, I have like this favorite section of it where you can just see, oh, it's right here. You can just see, I just had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know what drafting was. I was really fighting. I remember both the wheel and the fiber in this case. So this is good fiber too. I just recently spun something else from Wellspring Farms and it was absolutely lovely. This Jacob, I have this piece right here that is just unspun fiber. I mean, what, do you see that? What is that? I mean, if I pulled the wrong way, I could just pull this apart. And then right in this same section, I have some just really, really ropey, some would say overspun pieces of yarn. You can see my draft was really inconsistent, and the thing that I learned in making this yarn is that it's really important that you don't have an absolute death grip on your fiber. So a lot of the common verbiage that's used to describe this is to hold your fiber like you're holding a baby bird. So really delicately and gently. This also helps prevent you from like compacting your own fiber. Some fibers are really, really sensitive to felting and compaction. Now, granted, these are generally fibers that we don't recommend for beginners, but as I've mentioned, we all come to fiber arts in different ways. So, you know, we don't always know what the common advice is for the craft before we get into it. And so, yeah, that's my first ever skein of yarn. And my tip is be gentle with your fiber, no matter what you're spinning to. I've heard this idea that spinning wool and cotton are quote unquote opposite. And because of that, one of them, you should be like tightly gripping the fiber. Neither of them should you really be like tightly gripping anything. You should just be gentle with your fiber. My next skein of yarn that I'm bringing out is this Suffolk fleece. So this is the very first fleece I ever like hand processed. And as you can see, I had no idea how to spin a down breed. I mean, some of these pieces, I certainly added enough twist to it, but other portions, I mean, like right here, there's just, there's no twist here. I mean, I could pull this yarn apart if I wanted to. And my next piece of advice that comes with this fiber is to do a little bit of research on the ways and methods that people generally spin the type of fiber that you have. So this can really help prevent you from making some like beginner mistakes with certain fibers. Some things have a tendency to be overspun. Some things have a tendency to be underspun. And depending on those factors, even as a beginner, you can start to adjust the way you spin to the fiber. And I just think that that is a really good exercise to try as a beginner to figure out what more and less twist looks like and feels like for you when it comes to the like rhythmic act of spinning, right? Because the way at least for me that I get the most consistent yarn is that I get into a consistent rhythm with that yarn, a rhythm with my drafting, with the amount that I'm drafting, the speed that I'm drafting, my treadle, all of these different things. And so if you're trying to spin different types of fibers in a way that they don't really want to be spun or perhaps cannot be spun, you know, there are especially shorter stapled fibers that will just fall apart if you do not put enough twist in them. It might seem like they are holding together as they feed onto the bobbin, but then the second you try to ply them, they fall apart. Gosh, we've all been there too. It happens to the best of us. So experiment is really, I guess my next tip is like try different things, experiment, research. Don't be afraid to take your time getting to a fiber. Again, this is not this is not going to be a quick thing. You know, we're making yarn by hand. If we wanted it to be fast, we could just go buy the yarn. All right, remind yourself that, take your time, do a little research beforehand. You don't have to, too. Of course, you don't have to do research, but a lot of beginners worry about accidentally ruining a fiber. And I think one way that I at least get over that hurdle mentally is to educate myself about the fiber and prepare myself for the spin. So if I educate myself and I find out, oh, this has a tendency again to float apart if there's not enough twist in it. Well, now I don't have to worry about over twisting it. That's what I tell myself in my brain. I'm like, it's okay. At least you're not going to over twist it. At least you're not going to overspin it. Maybe this brings no comfort to other people, but it brings comfort to me. All right, so after that underspun situation, right, I was starting to learn that I had a tendency to underspin, especially as a beginner spinner, at least for me. Overspinning was never really a huge issue for me, and I think that has to do with the fact that I did start with an electric eel wheel 6, so an e-spinner. And I do think that the tension on e-spinners can be a bit bitey, especially if you're a beginner and you're trying to, again, get your yarn to feed onto the bobbin for the first time, which can be really annoying and stressful. My hot tip for that is beeswax. Beeswax on the bobbin, beeswax on your leader that feeds onto the bobbin as well. It will make starting your bobbin a lot easier as just a first-time spinner. Bonus tip right there. Just get yourself a little bit of crafter's beeswax. After that really underspun spin, I did this really overspun Wensleydale. This was my first endeavor into a dyed long wool fiber in a braid that I had just stumbled upon in the wild. When I was sold this braid, I was given it at a discount because it was compacted. They told me that going into it, so I knew what I was getting myself into, but it really wasn't that compacted. I kind of just fluffed it all up, and it was really easy to spin. I had also learned another piece of advice after my underspinning incident, which was that I should not let my wheel or my fiber bully me. Now, essentially what that means is there are certain times when if you're being bullied by your wheel or your fiber, you'll know. You know what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's like the fiber being literally ripped out of your hands. And depending on the type of wheel that you have, that can be adjusted more or less. Now, I don't own any Saxony style wheels, and I do not own any Irish tension systems, so no Irish tension wheels. I have wheels that are capable of double drive and Scotch tension. So I really am just talking about like castle style wheels and double drive and Scotch tension systems when I talk about this next part. If your fiber is being ripped out of your hands, a lot of the times what I suggest is first you need to turn your tension down. As a beginner spinner, I really thought that the fiber was supposed to be like kind of pulled from my hand. And that is one of the reasons that I think as a beginner spinner, I definitely did a lot of like long draw without even knowing what it was called yet, because the fiber was being like torn from my hands. And listen, some people, that is just the way that they prefer to spin. However, if you feel like you can't keep up with that, like that is just irritating you to no end, then your wheel is bullying you. We're going to fix it. It's okay. So we're going to turn our tension down a little bit. And then if you are spinning on a traditional wheel, so not an e-spinner, I'm talking something along the lines of my shaft and my lendrum, you can see them back there, you can adjust your whirl. So when you adjust your whirl, you're adjusting your ratio, which essentially means you are changing the amount of twist that enters the yarn per treadle or per turn of the drive wheel, which if you've been listening since episode 2 of the Wool to Gold podcast, you know what the drive wheel is already. And if you want to go back to that video and learn about wheel anatomy, I will link it below. But if you adjust your ratio to be a little bit lower, possibly as low as it's willing to go, this can also help stop the wheel from bullying you. Another piece of advice that I generally give is to just slow down your treadle. Just slow down. I think because I started on an e-spinner where I had to physically reach out and stop the wheel, I don't have a tendency to treadle for my life, which is what spinners call when beginners get panicked and instead of stopping, they start to treadle faster, and which generally, in a lot of cases, does make the problem a little bit worse or just a little bit more annoying to deal with because you're adding more twists to the yarn at a faster rate. Okay, so my next piece of advice is possibly the most important piece of advice. So if you take anything away from this, please take this away. When you're spinning yarn, you need to be nice to yourself. So I am someone who does not like it when I am not immediately good at things. I think there are a lot of people out there who can really sympathize with that. I am also a bit of a control freak in certain aspects of my life as well. I have a tendency to be very hard on myself and be just an insane perfectionist. So one of the reasons that I've just always been sort of like enchanted by the idea of spinning yarn, besides the actual act of spinning yarn, is because, at least in my experience, a lot of the community is focused on being just like nice to yourself and less harsh to yourself while you're learning to spin yarn. I knew that this was going to be a really difficult part of the process for me, but so many other spinners had told me, you know, if you're mean to yourself while you're spinning yarn, you're not going to want to keep spinning yarn. And your first few skeins are just not going to be good. That is a reality of it. Even if you are a yarn spinning savant, which God bless if you are. I mean, I'm so glad you're joining the community, but even the yarn spinning savant, I'm sure, would admit to having at least one or two first skeins that are less than perfect, less than ideal. So if you're mean to yourself while you're doing this, you're not going to make more, and then you're never going to get better. Alongside this note, I think another thing that is imperative when you start hand spinning, and I know it can be so hard because we get so into spinning and it takes up all your time, but use your hand spun. So why do these two things kind of go hand in hand? At least when it comes to these pieces right here. You're probably like, why is he holding these things? Why is he flopping them around the screen? These are projects that all sort of happened at the same time. Clearly, I never did use these singles, but this, along with these skeins that I spun here that went into this hat, are some of the first skeins that I was actually proud of. And it was really hard for me to admit that I was actually proud of this skein when I spun it up. So this was my first bat spin. It was really hard. It was really, really difficult. It did not spin very consistent, but I did spin some fairly consistent singles of CVM, which is what the brown is in this. And I plied them together. And even though it was not a great consistent ply job at all, I was really happy with this yarn because it was just pretty. It was just nice to look at. I was really proud of it. It's the first time I really let myself feel that way about the yarn, because up until that point I had been pretty harsh on myself. I was like, you are spinning all this yarn and a lot of it is coming out not great. Not the way I wanted it to. That's what I'll say. Okay, so this one came, and then I spun up these singles, and these singles just, honestly, now I look at them too, and I'm like, wow, a lot of this is pretty overspun, actually, and it's not very consistent, but this was a really big jump for me in terms of consistency. I was really proud of this, and I'm still proud of young Brian for spinning this yarn, and for almost being brave enough to be like, I am proud of this not perfect thing that I made. I don't know, for me, that was big progress as someone who is consistently really, really harsh on themselves. And then, because of the confidence that I got from spinning this, I was able to spin these incredibly consistent and mind you, a gradient, gray natural fleece. And I mean, that came out beautiful. No one can say that doesn't look almost like a commercial yarn. I mean, there are some like thick and thin spots that I kind of rolled under the brim, honestly. But for the most part, it is honestly a really impressive spin, especially for a beginner. And the way that I got such a consistent spin too brings me to another thing that is just a really nice piece of advice. I got this from Tashi on Stitches and Starlight. I think she is the queen of trying to record a lot of details with her spins. I really respect her game. It's why I have all these tags that have like, my beginner tags don't have that much info on them, but now my tags are filled with information. And I love that. I love that progress for me. But start making tags for your yarn, start recording details, and make a spinner's reference card for your larger spins. So honestly, this I think was probably not even 3 ounces of this like gray fiber that I had. I actually think it was 4 when I bought it, but I used some of it in another project. So it wasn't even 4 ounces, but it felt like a big spin for me. So I made a card that I had a piece of like my ideal yarn tied to that I had already spun of that fiber. And that made such a difference. Like, I could just constantly refer back to it throughout my spin. Every yard, if I wanted to be that neurotic and crazy, I could. I let myself do that because this is my craft and my spin. And sometimes that's how I have fun, by being neurotic. So yeah, that's something that this project I wear all the time. And I'm still really proud of this. And it makes me super happy to just look at it. And I think those are probably my best tips that you're going to get from me. On this. I think especially be nice to yourself while you're spinning. You will be able to spin great yarns like me so much faster than you think. I promise. Especially if you dedicate yourself to trying to spin 15 minutes every day. Like, small increments every single day will do wonders, because it's just like crochet and knitting. It's a muscle memory thing. So the more you do it and the more it just becomes memory, the more consistent your yarn is going to get. Now, once you get into the world of spinning, you'll also want to develop breaking out of those skills and spinning more inconsistent yarns, or, you know, playing with things like energized singles and things like that. Playing with the concept of what is actually overspun and underspun is one of my favorite things. I did want to talk about, because if you follow me on Instagram, you've seen my really crazy textured bubble crepe yarn that I spun. It was a really, really technical spin. It's probably still to this day the most technical spin I've done. In order to accomplish that like textured bubble crepe look and those sort of like bubbles popping out at you, you do need your singles to be pretty consistently energized. But in all of that beautiful glory, in order to get to that point in my textured and art yarn spinning journey, I had to go through plenty of skeins that looked like this skein. It makes me happy in like a different way. It makes me laugh. Oh my gosh, this like maybe 4 or 5 yard skeins made me cry. Real tears, real actual tears came out of my face, because all of the core spinning videos online that I had seen had made it seem so easy. Heck, I know people who were introduced to spinning with core spinning. They didn't even spin yarn like from fiber by itself at first. They spun core spinning. You spin sort of around a base yarn, usually a commercial yarn. In this case, I used cotton. If I were to respin this, I would totally use a mohair base. That's more my preference now, just personally, or even alpaca before I would use a cotton base. I just don't like to core spin on cotton. It's, again, personal preference. Lots of people love core spinning on cotton. Try it before you knock it, please. But yeah, I mean, I bet my actual salty tears are somewhere in this skein. I cursed it, and I was like, I'm never, ever, ever going to make art yarn ever again. It's horrible, and I hate it. And one of the reasons that I hated it so much was because I definitely had my ratio set way too high. I was definitely still using I think I spun this on my fast flyer on my shacked, not even the medium flyer. I'm sorry, my fast whirl on my shacked, not even my medium whirl. And that's probably why I cried actual tears doing this. Later on, I would try to do my first core spin on the Lendrum, and I didn't even skein this up. That's how frustrated I got. I feel like you guys get to see all of the happy-go-lucky, fun Brian, and you guys don't really get to see when things do go really tough for me and I get frustrated. I tried to thread ply some of this. You can see this is just this is a mess. And I definitely got super upset making this too. This was just the struggle bus. Definitely because, again, on my Lendrum, with my double treadle, I definitely went a little too fast on my double treadle when I first got my Lendrum. Now I tend to go a little too slow. I don't know why. I drag on my Lendrum. Next up, this is a super recent finish. So this is my very first skein of like drop spindled hand spun. My drop spin game upgraded so quickly. It's unbelievable. I highly recommend drop spinning. Again, I've had so much fun doing it, but even my first skein of drop spin was really inconsistent, even though I know how to draft on a traditional wheel. I have 2 of them, and I know how to draft on an e-spinner. But again, this is just something different. It's a different muscle memory to learn. And honestly, one of the reasons that I've really kind of invited drop spinning into my life is because it's just a nice reminder to the people who are following me along on my spinner's journey that we all start somewhere. We are all a beginner at some point. I wish so desperately that I had started a YouTube or recording my spinner's journey on TikTok so much earlier, because there are so many people who are already so deep into their spinner's journey, right? Who have been spinning yarn for a decade, maybe more, and have those resources on TikTok. And I'm so appreciative of those resources. I'm sure you guys are too, but it's also really nice to like actually see a beginner struggling. And again, that's why I want to share. I want to share these things with you guys, because look at that. It's not it's not the best yarn. It's not great. I'm probably never going to use this. I'm just going to keep this as a little keepsake. All of these yarns that I have here, I'm really not planning on using, especially now. They're really just teaching tools so I can hand them to people. And they're like, what's this crap? And I'm like, that's my crap. That's what it is. So and then I did just want to bring out the cow yarn. I'm going to bring it out of its bag for once. I'm going to risk it shedding all over and getting these itchy cow hairs everywhere. But this is what I would consider my very first, like, actual art yarn in a conceptual sense. I feel like people say art yarn when they mean textured yarn, but when I say art yarn, sometimes I just mean skeins that, like, this is the art. It will never be made into anything. This is a finished object right here, and it is, all those hairs are cow, like Holstein cow, like beef cattle, not Highlander hair, which I do have a follower on TikTok who is sending me some Highlander fiber to work with just for funsies, just because he's like, I like what you do. I've heard you can spin this. I would like to send you some. So I'll absolutely update you guys on spinning Highland cow, because that sounds like wonderful. I can't wait to do something really cool with that yarn. I'll probably make it into a bag or something like that. This is the cow yarn. I had a lot of fun spinning this. I think if I were to spin this again, I would give this yarn a little bit more twist and a higher ply twist as well, just to prevent some of the shedding that like happens every single time I move this bag. It's the reason it gets stored in its special plastic baggie. And I'm pretty sure I already gave this tip, but I'm just going to reiterate it. Experiment. Have some fiber around that is not so unbelievably precious to you that you don't want to risk wasting it on things like this, which again, things like this are not a waste. This is not a waste. This is learning. This is you gaining muscle memory and gaining knowledge, and it's an important step in your spinner's journey. You're going to have skeins like this that are just, you too will have a bag of yarns that you don't use, but you just keep to remind you of where you've come from. But you're not going to be able to get to the good part if you don't mess around and experiment. And if you do have a tendency to only buy fiber that you end up kind of like hoarding, you're worried about ruining, what I recommend is do a thrifty girl move and find yourself some destash fiber. So go to eBay, go to Facebook, go to Ravelry has destash forums and pages as well, if Ravelry is your thing. Heck, people destash on, I've seen destashes on Instagram, on Reddit. Just start looking for fiber destash or mill ends, fiber mill ends. Just like how there are yarn mill ends, there's fiber mill ends as well. When I first started spinning, bought a bunch of fiber mill ends in gray, lilac and white and just played with those colors. I think that playing with gray, white, black as a spinner is a really good idea in the beginning, because what those colors will do to skeins of yarn, I think will surprise you. They at least surprised me as somebody who doesn't always play with color in that way. Which is to say, like, mixing color. I like to play with color in my outfits and pairing things together, but I don't often mix color. Like, I'm not a painter or anything like that. And my last spinner's tip is going to be, don't be afraid to get lots of different types of information from lots of different sources. If you already subscribe to something like Playa Magazine, you already know spinners disagree. Spinners disagree all the time. They will disagree until the end of time, and they will do things and create things that are supposed to prove that other things cannot exist, and yet they do, and yet they get done. There are people who will tell you that you can't do X, Y, or Z, and there are other people who will tell you, I always do X, Y, and Z. I just think it's worth going and finding lots of different resources and, you know, figuring out for yourself which camp you end up falling into, and maybe proving things right or wrong for yourself. There will also always be some information floating around that is just a little bit outdated, and it's worth finding those things out and not just taking every source of information for its face value. I'm sure at some point during my time on this channel, I will have to issue a recall of some kind of information, some kind of misinformation I accidentally stated. Or alternatively, there will just be times when new science comes out and we know new things. I think one really interesting example of this was on the Jillian Eve podcast this week. So if you don't follow Evie's channel, go check her out. I'm gonna put her channel down in the comments. On her most recent video, she has an old hand carder, and she talks about how it is old knowledge to store your hand carders with greasy fleece because of the materials that hand carders used to be made out of. However, this knowledge doesn't really apply anymore because of the materials that hand carders are made out of nowadays. I find these types of things super interesting and fun to learn, but I do know that it can be really confusing and overwhelming for beginners. So I recommend that you have a few different sources of information at minimum for where you get your spinning information from. We all have different learning styles, different ways of presenting information. Some weeks I am really meticulous and organized, and some weeks I am not, just like this week. I hope you guys didn't mind the chaos too much, and I'm hoping that next week we're going to be able to get to my stash flash. So if you want to see all of my fiber in all of its glory, give me a follow. If you don't already follow me on Instagram and TikTok, and you do have those socials, I'll link them below. And I'll also link the Wool to Gold shop. On my shop, I just have a few of my extra hand-spun skeins, and it's really just another way that you can help support my art. Thanks for coming and hanging out again, fiber friends, and I'll see you guys next week.